first volume, we noticed how the Spirit of God came down suddenly into the crowded and cramped corners of a little part of Manhattan and eventually burst like a forest fire until it moved through halls of legislation and seeped down into public schoolrooms and covered the United States, capturing 1 million souls for Christ. But a similar thing happened in Great Britain at the same time. It's my interest now to take you over and show you how a revival came to Wales. The story of the origin of the Welsh revival involves the names of two people and a little piece of professional jealousy. The first of these people is Humphrey Rowland Jones, a 22-year-old Welshman who applied for ordination into the ministry and was rejected. The rejection utterly shattered him. He decided to leave his native land and go to the United States, where his parents had previously migrated a few years before. And while he was there, two important things happened to him. Number one, although he was living in the area of Wisconsin, he was exposed to the effects of the prayer meetings in Fulton Street in 1857. Number two, he was ordained. This time it was into the Methodist Episcopal Church, an Arminian group, and when he got that ordination, he decided to come back to his native land in 1858. Jones returned to Wales, his native land, and in an area not very far from where I'm standing, he conducted a 5-week mission, and God gave him an unusually rich harvest of souls. And that aroused the curiosity of the second person of my story, a minister named David Morgan. Morgan had been praying for a revival for the last 10 years, and he was somewhat suspicious of Jones. In the first place, living in a strongly Calvinistic area, Jones came into the story as an Arminian in his theology. And in the second place, Jones had been to America, was suspicious that Americanism had rubbed off on him. But the stories of the conversions persisted. So Morgan decided he had to meet Jones. He went to hear him preach. He was profoundly impressed and deeply convicted. When he got a hold of Jones, he asked him, would he join him in preaching and in prayer? And the two denominations started holding united prayer meetings. One of those prayer meetings happened here in the church that was pastored by David Morgan in this little village of Ysbyty Ystwyth. And here the revival broke out in that church directly behind me. A man came to the services one night from the town of Tregaron, and he became so infected by the revival that happened in this church that he went back to Tregaron and he conducted a service, and 78 people were converted that first night, and the revival had begun in Wales. I'm standing at the moment in the beautiful idyllic scenery of the Midlands of Wales. Behind me you can see the coastal town of Aberystwyth. I'm here to emphasize one fact. The revival that came to Wales came to every single county in Wales. Now that's remarkable. There's 1,000 different hamlets and villages in this country, and nearly every one of them was touched by that revival. On top of which, half the population of this country spoke Welsh, not English. So the revival had to come into another language in order to reach the entire country. In fact, it was so exclusively a Welsh revival that only one English county was affected by it, and that was a county that abutted the borders of Wales, and it's because it had a large Welsh-speaking population. There's no question. This revival in this country was exclusively a Welsh revival. Revival came amidst prayer. Prayer never forces the Spirit of God to do something, but the Spirit of God never operates without prayer being the atmosphere in which he does it. If the Spirit of God is a sovereign Spirit, and we believe that he is, and the wind bloweth where it listeth, then he will never be forced to do something because people had met to pray. But for some reason or another, as far as the record goes, he never does anything unless prayer is the atmosphere in which it. I've got an illustration of a case in point. The island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides in northwest Scotland was shutting down its churches. The elders became so concerned that they sent a circulated letter that was to be read from the pulpit of all of the churches, encouraging people to come to repentance and ask God to forgive. An 84-year-old blind woman, when the notice was read in her church, encouraged her minister to try prayer. The minister agreed that he would do it and promised her that he and some other elders would meet at 9 o'clock on Tuesday and Friday night and would stay on their faces before God until 4 o'clock in the morning. And that lady promised those men that she and her sister would stand the same vigil with them in prayer. They then decided to invite a man by the name of Duncan Campbell to come for a 10-day meeting. Campbell declined the invitation because the schedule called him to another summer camp, and he found himself just unable to go. The old lady told the elders when it was reported to her, "Don't worry, God will bring him here." It happened that the meetings that had been scheduled were canceled. There'd been some overbookings in the local hotels, and they were unable to hold the meetings. Campbell went to the island. When he went there, they had their first meeting at 7 o'clock at night, and the buildings were crammed to capacity. And the meeting didn't end until 2 o'clock in the morning. The crowds just simply seemed to multiply. So many of them were there. They scheduled services every night at 7 o'clock, at 10 o'clock, then at 1 o'clock in the morning, then at 3 o'clock in the morning. But Duncan Campbell would be the first one to tell you the revival didn't come from anything that he did. I could almost quote him to you verbatim, where he said, "I did not bring the revival to the island of Lewis. It came when 7 men and 2 women met to pray." A remarkable feature was that men who were normally unskillful in verbal communication, once they got on their knees and got into the throne room, they became eloquent. It was as though their heart was on fire and their whole soul found articulate expression through their mouth, and they became eloquent. They weren't old-time worn phrases and recitations that people use so frequently in prayer. I got a beautiful illustration about a little girl during the Welsh revival. Children were remarkable on their knees in prayer. This little girl was heard to pray, "O Lord, knock on the door of my Father's heart once more. You've done it before, but I'd like you to knock on his heart again. And this time, Lord, if he doesn't answer it, would you take the door off its hinges?" There's an eloquence that comes in the spirit of revival when people meet together to pray. Finally, when you talk about prayer and revival, I've got to comment on the fact that there was power in prayer. I struggle to find an illustration of it, but perhaps David Morgan, the Welsh revivalist, would give me a good illustration. Morgan met a man in the town and asked him if he would come to the prayer meeting, and the man said no. He said, why? Because he was a businessman, and he would lose business. Morgan asked him, well, how much business would you lose, and what would it cost you to spend an hour at the prayer meeting? Morgan said, I'd be willing to pay that. No, he said, there'd be other lingering effects, and I really don't want to go to the prayer meeting. There was a group of stones under Morgan's feet. Morgan simply leaned over, knelt down on the stones, and then prayed that God would break the heart of this stubborn man. The man interrupted his praying and cried, "Stop, stop, I'll come." He wasn't willing to come because of the arguments of Morgan. But once Morgan started praying, he didn't want to be the object of his prayers. And Morgan did not exclusively know the power of prayer. Everybody that prayed during the revival, in some form or another, found that prayer had power, and God responded. Prayer is definitely a part of revival. The third feature of the Welsh revival, and one that everybody would expect, is that there was an expression of emotions, as there is in every revival. But the emotions in the Welsh revival, and I don't mean to say that they were unique in Wales, but there were two very common ways in which they expressed themselves. To illustrate one of them, I've brought you here to the Morlaeus Castle. I'm standing at the moment on the highest point of that castle, on the area that's known as the Dais. It happens that the castle was first built in 1290, when two barons were squabbling with each other, and one was accusing the other of stealing his cattle. And so they built this structure in order to protect himself, his family, and his cattle. The earliest sketch that we have of the castle goes back to 1741, and you can tell even in that day the castle was in ruins. On a section where I'm standing, this highest point, known as the Dais, there were walls built around it that gave the impression of a tower, and it made it possible for the people that lived here to look all the way up this valley and see if anybody was coming where they needed to protect themselves. You can tell by looking behind me that there was a moat that was built, and that took a lot of work. And all the rock that came out to make the room for the moat was used in order to build the walls for it. On one side of it, there was a sheer precipice, so that they were protected by nature on that side. And something that you would never have expected on a mountain like this, they had a well that supplied all the water that they needed within the castle, and you can see some of the ruins of the old walls that are there, and attached to those walls were the barracks. There's no question this was an extremely impressive fortress in its day. My interest in being here at the Morlaeus Castle goes to the year 1859, when the revival came here. This little village behind me was struck by the revival, and a unique and uncommon thing was happening up here at the castle site. There is a place where the ironworks were held during those days, and the men that lived there were rough, crude, ungodly people. On a Sunday morning at 4 o'clock, they would fill buckets with beer and alcohol, and they would all come up to this castle, although it was in ruins, and they would intend to spend the entire Sabbath day in revelry and in rioting and in fighting. There were 20 young men that were converted during the revival, and they determined to come up here and interrupt the revelry. They decided they were going to come up here and conduct a prayer meeting. Now that's ridiculous, and that's exactly what they were told at 5:30 on Sunday morning when the 20 men appeared at the castle grounds. They were asked by the ruffians, "What do you intend to do?" And they said, "We intend to conduct a prayer meeting up here." They were scoffed, and they were cursed. But one young man put his hand in his pocket and took out a New Testament, and he started reading a portion of the New Testament, and a strange, eerie quietness started falling on the place. By the time that they had collectively sung a hymn and then started in a round of prayer, they suddenly realized the whole place was in quietness. And by the time they finished their prayer and they looked at these godless men that were standing here, every single one of the men was weeping. That's the point that I want to bring out about the Welsh revival. The Welsh revival produced the effect of weeping on people. It hardly ever came to a church or to a group of people that were standing indoor or outdoor, but the minute the conviction fell upon people, they started crying, and weeping became an era of the Welsh revival. The second feature of the revival is not the outburst of emotion, it's an expression of emotion in music. An elder was saying some words in a church service, and he spoke about the greatness of God. a young lady with a high-pitched voice, but lovely, said, "Amen. Blessed be his name forever." And it was like a blast at the quarry, as though 1,000 pieces of fragments were scattered through the air. Everybody immediately jumped up from their seats, and they started exalting God in various and different ways. Some of them started crying on God to come and forgive them for their sins, and others started praising God, and out of it came a melody of music. The feature, known in Wales as the Mollianw, means the singing of praise, became so common that Wales today is known as a musical nation. Do you know that the effect of the 1859 revival lingers so long that when they go to a football match today, they sing Welsh hymns? You can hear them at the football match when they're supporting Wales playing football, and they're singing "Bread of Heaven, feed me till I want no more." And nobody can sing it anywhere in the world like the Welsh people can. Where I'm standing at the moment is a natural amphitheatre in Cambuslang in Glasgow, Scotland. It was here that 30,000 people came, and they listened to the preaching of a man by the name of George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a very moving and mighty evangelist, and he conducted a service here what really centered around the Lord's table. And when he did, 3,000 people participated. They were given metal tokens that would allow them to come to the table, but they were investigated before they ever became the recipients of those tokens. But that really is only a backdrop to what happened in 1859, because the year for that was back in 1742, 117 years before the revival of 1859 came. Why am I making reference to it? I'm making reference to it because you can't study the origination of a revival without being impressed by the fact they always are preceded by prayer. But let me deal with that later. A second thing that preceded the revival in Scotland was a revival. It was 117 years previous. It was George Whitefield that brought it to Cambuslang. It was a powerful, sweeping, mighty movement of God that came to Scotland. Let me explain to you how it happened. The man's name was Dr. William McCulloch. He was the minister of this church beside this amphitheater. He was a dry preacher. I'm being honest. He was known as the ale preacher. That's because when it came to the part of his service that he started preaching, he had members of his congregation that literally got up and walked out and went to a bar and drank ale while he went through his sermon. But something happened one night. It was Thursday, and it was Bible study time, and it was February the 18th in 1742. When he finished the service, a number of people started following him to his parsonage. There were 50 of them altogether. They crowded into that little parsonage, filling all of the rooms, all of the corridors and hallways of it, and they started wailing and lamenting and praying that God would give them forgiveness of sins. They were there literally the whole night long. It was the next morning before the sobs and tears of regret became songs of joy and praises that filled the air in the early morning. The result of it was they couldn't get the people into the church, so they started meeting out here in the open air. Then they started conducting daily meetings in the open air, and then they invited George Whitefield to come. The celebration, as I mentioned, was for the purpose of keeping the Lord's Supper, and there were 3,000 people down here in this ravine that kept the Lord's Supper under the influence of George Whitefield. But that was 117 years before the revival came in 1859. That movement of God on this community had a staggering impact on this nation. Don't think that Cambuslang was limited, either in location or in time. That's why I've come here to the community of Shotts, and behind me is the famous Kirk o' Shats, or as we say in English, the Church of Scots. It was during the communion season. Now, in the Church of Scotland, they didn't conduct communion the way we do in other churches. They had them about 3 times a year, and they were a special set-apart season. There was a period of preparation for communion in which messages were delivered for that purpose. Then there was the celebration of communion, and then there was one great service for the giving of thanks. It was the Thanksgiving service that brought Reverend John Livingston into the picture. They invited him to come preach. Well, he came and saw the crowds that had assembled and became afraid, and so he ran away. But they were able to find him and bring him back. And when he brought him back, the people were standing on the outside of the church. It was in pouring rain, and he stood up and delivered a message that took over 1 hour to deliver. But they weren't satisfied with what he did. They wanted another hour of preaching, and he preached for the 2nd hour. There were some 500 people who dated the day of their conversion, the day that they stood for 2 hours listening to John Livingston preach in the rain, here at the Kirk o' Shats. That shows you that Cambuslang was not limited, and that also shows you that what happened here at the Kirk o' Shats was also not limited. I wanted to talk to you for a moment about the part that is played with prayer in a revival. I could have gone to any part of Scotland to do it, but I decided to come here to the city of Edinburgh that lies below me and behind me. It is the capital city of Scotland, and they had a significant impact in their prayer life. It was in April of 1858 that a group of them got together, so determined to pray that God would send a revival that they organized a weekly prayer meeting, and they met every Monday. It wasn't for 20 months in January of 1860 that they changed it from a weekly prayer meeting to a daily prayer meeting. That was the burden that prayer was that got a hold of people. It was stated by the United Presbyterian Church, the church that was the state church of Scotland, that 1/4 of its registered members were sometime in the week involved in a prayer meeting. On May the 30th in 1858, that's exactly a month after those weekly prayer meetings began, 4 men met together in a place called Corrubber's Close on the Royal Mile, which we know as High Street today. Those 4 men took over a place that had been occupied by a group of atheists previously, and they met there to pray. The result of their prayer was that they started inviting boys and girls to come and listen to the gospel. So many started coming that within 18 months of that time, the group had grown so great they had to move to Queen's Park, and as many as 10,000 people would be in the crowd. On the fringe of the crowd at one of those open-air meetings was an American evangelist by the name of D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody became so impressed, he raised money, and what today is known as the Corrubber's Close Mission has been occupying space on the Royal Mile, just a few houses away from John Knox's house, and is doing it year after year since the days of D.L. Moody, meeting on a weekly basis, and thousands upon thousands of people have come to know Christ. There is no question, prayer had an enormous impact on the revival movement of 1859 in Scotland. Going back to the year 1858 reminds me that an American evangelist by the name of Charles Finney came to this city, and he conducted services, finding the largest places where they could accommodate crowds. And in spite of the fact that they had buildings where they could get as many as 1,800 people into the building, the streets around them were crowded with as many as thousands of people who had to be turned away because they were unable to get admission. Again, I say, the impact and the effect that prayer had on revival was very conspicuous in this city of Edinburgh and in all the environs that are around the city. Revival, however, came to Glasgow before it came to Edinburgh, and when it came, it was like a sudden shower. It was the 15th of August, 1859. The place was the Stockwell Free Church. Because of the renovation of the city, it doesn't stand today. They received such an outpouring of blessing that was evidenced in weeping by the people that they called a meeting 4 days later on the Glasgow Green, where I'm standing at the moment. On this green, 20,000 people assembled. It was a year later that they called for another meeting, and the same number of people gathered together on the green. And the green became famous a little bit later because it is here when D.L. Moody, the American evangelist, came to Glasgow that he pitched his tent. He was able to accommodate 2,500 people in that tent, and later on had such a successful mission that a block away from here they built a place that was called the Tent Hall, and it accommodated 2,500 people. And it was one of the most active and aggressive evangelical witnesses in Scotland until just a few years ago. It doesn't any longer exist. In the northeast of Scotland, the revival broke out shortly after it did here in Glasgow, but that was because they were having prayer meetings seeking God's face on the matter of revival since 1858. In Inverness, all the way down to Aberdeen, there were people that were being saved in the most unusual fashion. However, those revival fires didn't get up into the Orkney Islands until 1862. Revival came to the centre of Scotland around the community of Perth on the 20th of August 1860. There had been a gathering of some 4,000 people, and 7 ministers were needed in order to meet their spiritual needs. The result of that day brought thousands of people into a personal acquaintance with Jesus Christ. It spread all across the community. In the outskirts of Dundee, 21 miles away, an army officer gave a report of what he had heard and what he had witnessed.